Good evening, Tom. For most of us, this is our first weekend back to, or for some of us, it's to public masses. A lot of places it won't be until next week, and some places don't even know when. But you've been going for a couple of weeks now, and I'd just like to know, what was attendance like this week?
Oh, it was amazing, Janet. Last week, and we shared this on the last show, we got there 20 minutes early, and we ended up in the last pew, literally. And that was only because another big Catholic family had other family in the church, so they vacated their entire pew to meet up with their other family further up. So we got in. We were the last ones in, right? Into the kingdom. So we said, we're getting there earlier. So we got there 30 minutes early. And guess where we ended up? In the last pew. And there was a bigger crowd behind us than there was in front of us. So not only was the entire church filled, but they had proper spacing wherever people were sitting in the vestibule. They filled the church hall with proper spacing, and they even had to put a few people up into the choir loft, again, proper social distancing. But it was just glorious. This is the high mass. It went an hour and 45 minutes. And it was glorious, just beautiful.
And your kids didn't rebel?
My kids insisted that we go to that mass.
Yeah.
And again, I just have to tell you, it was, they're not able to articulate the way in which sacred music is really stirring them.
Mm-hmm.
And the reverent silence and the faith, the radiant faith of the community. But they were there for sure because of the fellowship with their friends. So you need to hear that. There are a bunch of teenage kids that are going to the traditional Latin Mass, high Mass, that lasts an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. Isn't that great? We have to go to that Mass, Dad.
Yeah. Well, as I told you before, I felt all this last year and a half or so that God has been tricking me into going to the traditional Mass. It wasn't something I intentionally embarked upon. And Friday night, I was just sitting doing some stupid stuff on my phone, and it was time to go to bed. And I'm telling myself, go to bed. And I'm still, sorry, God, I don't know why I'm so attached to doing nothing on my phone. I should just pray and go to bed. And at that moment, their notice came out up on my phone about a Mass being held at a church that's 35 minutes away at 8 in the morning, high TLM on Saturday morning. And I'm going, what? I mean, what? And I was already late. I wasn't going to get my full sleep, but I thought, oh my gosh, I got to get up and I got to shower and I got to get dressed and I have to have a little bit of breakfast and I have to get there. I hardly slept that night. It was just like a kid for Christmas, And I went, and it's in a very inner city church in Detroit, and as we know, often, in fact, it wasn't given to these. It's a new order, the Franciscans of the Holy Spirit. And they were a break off of another Franciscan group and were accepted by Bishop Olmsted in Phoenix. But they're in Detroit because their men are going to the Detroit Seminary. And I had the guy who's the head of the study, it's sort of like a studium, just a wonderful young priest. And this is basically a charismatic order, but again, they've discovered the Latin Mass. And so they've started offering it. And I went tonight. They have a 5 o'clock Mass in the evening. And there's almost nobody in the church. There were 30 people there. There were like 4 big families, young families, maybe the oldest was 10, but 5 kids each. So that was about half the people there were these 3 families, and then a couple adults. He says it's not a well-attended parish anyway, but it's just a beautiful thing. It was just like God just said, okay, this is the first public Masses there are. I'm going to let you know about this, which I normally wouldn't have known about it. Now, I've heard from several people who've gone to Mass this weekend all over different parts of the country, and they're tremendously disappointed at the attendance. Somewhere under 30% of what they're allowed to have. I mean, they're allowed to have 150, and less than 50, like 35, are showing up. So I don't know what that means. I don't know if people are just still afraid of going, or if people have lost interest. We've sort of, I'm not sure. I'm sure nobody really intended this, but for a long time we've heard people say, "Oh, I'm spiritual, I'm religious, I love to go for a hike, and I sit down and I praise God's creation. So I don't see why I need formalized religion. I don't know why I need to go to church." So I don't know if that's creeping in to Catholics' sensibilities, that Mass is just not that necessary. Some priest wrote kind of a crazy column. I mean, it wasn't that crazy, but he was rebuking President Trump for saying that religious services are essential, and he's insisting that the governors recognize that. And a priest wrote and said, well, not for Catholics. They're not essential for Catholics. We have many ways of praying. Oh my gosh, we don't need that. But anyway, I had a great experience. But I wonder if you could start us here in prayer, Tom, and we'll start the evening.
Absolutely. In fact, Janet, just to build off of that, when I felt again just a call or a prompting, I felt the gift that I'd been given to be able to go to Mass, but I also sensed the pain and the loss of not being able to go to Mass, especially because I've got friends here in the state of Washington, closer to Seattle. They just don't have access yet. And the idea of getting to a place where there is just really not accessible. So I felt, again, that prompting to say, you know what, I need to be at Mass on behalf of them. And so to receive communion in a way that says, Lord, I just received communion for them, that they would receive the graces of this communion for them. Just so there's that beautiful sense of, I think, solidarity, that the standing together is something that I hope can emerge as a fruit from this, that not to take for granted the gift we've been given. And if we've been given it, we're given it not just for ourselves, but for the sake of others.
Yeah, and I think we very much have to pray for those that don't seem to have the burning desire to return. You know, if they're not returning because they're vulnerable, they're old, you know, or they're scared, you know, and there's so much information out there. I'm not going to say people are wrong to be scared. I've got my own views, but I don't think people have to line up with my views. They read the evidence as they read it, and that's fine. But I just don't want people staying away because they've fallen out of the habit, or they've begun to think that Mass is no big deal. So I think
it's too late. It's too late, Janet. The habit has been broken. It's 2 months. It's now 2 months for most folks. And so unless they've made, again, we've talked about this, a serious effort to maintain an intimate connection to the liturgy on the Lord's Day, the habit has fractured. It's weakened. It needs to be revved back up again.
Well, yeah, but I want to pray that that will happen.
Yes. Amen.
And I talked to a woman recently. It was just a beautiful thing. She's a convert, and she's had a just amazingly rough life, amazingly rough life. And she's found her way to the Catholic Church. God drew her right in. And one of her ways of evangelizing is when she goes like to the grocery store and the clerk asks her, how are you doing? She said, oh, I'm great. She said, I went to Mass this morning and I received Jesus in the Eucharist. And so how could I not be great? Because I received Jesus. And of course, the clerk is just like, what are you talking about? And so she has a little moment to evangelize. So I think that kind of response that we should start, you know, not only in the communion line, but again, when we're talking to our Catholic friends, how are things going? Well, they're great. I've been able to return to the Eucharist. It's really made a huge difference. I missed it and now I'm back. So maybe those who have drifted away might say, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe it's doing such great things for him. It should do great things for me.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of opportunities for evangelization here.
Amen. Maybe this will be one too. Let's pray.
Great.
In the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we pray in Jesus' holy name. And we thank you. And we ask that you, O Holy Spirit, would stir within us the conversation that glorifies the Father and edifies those who are watching or listening. Anoint us, and we ask that the radiant light, the glory of the traditional Latin Mass would shine forth in our conversation, and that it would truly yield some fruit, some good, Lord, in those who listen and in our lives as well. And we thank you in advance, Lord, for what you're doing. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Spirit. Amen.
All right. Thank you so much. The last episode was talking about why you and I have been drawn to the Latin Mass and what we found there. Yours was a lot of testimonies you began today about the excellence for your children. And mine was a lot about just the beauty of the prayers and the beauty of the liturgy and just the sense of peace and transcendence that I get when I'm at that Mass. And in that episode, we tried very hard not to sort of rev up the liturgy wars. We are just asking people to, as we say, most Catholics, probably under 5%, have ever had any experience of a Latin Mass. So we're trying to open their minds to the possibility that this is something they want to explore and take a look at. As well as never having any experience of the Latin Mass, most Catholics don't understand the history of it at all, how the Novus Ordo came to be. And so we're going to try to do a very fair-handed presentation of that. I hope I get it right. I've done a little PowerPoint, and I'm new to this. I've been reading a lot of books, but years, dates, facts, or something that my mind works with principles and arguments rather than with dates, historical dates. So I've been reading stuff, and I hope I got it right. I'm sure someone will correct us if we've got it wrong. So what Tom and I are going to do tonight is I'm going to do a brief history just of the Mass itself, very brief, very short history. Can't possibly do justice to it, but at least you'll have an overview. And then we're going to look at the passages from Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the document in Vatican II about the liturgy, to see what in fact it does say about what kind of changes Vatican II wanted in the traditional Latin Mass. And then we're going to look at a particular concept, active participation, and what John Paul II wanted us to understand about that. And at the very end, I think it's a surprise for Tom, I don't know if he saw it, if I added it to my PowerPoint before I send it to him, about some suggestions, both for the ways that the TLM might become more palatable to people and ways that the Novus Ordo might become closer to the TLM, because the Church does say we shouldn't have radically different masses. So something's got to happen to bring these two liturgies closer together. Okay?
Yeah, I'm excited, Janet. Yeah, it'll be neat to walk through this and hear what you have to say and dialogue with you about it.
Yeah, and I hope it's not too formal, Tom. I know you will, but yeah, certainly feel free to jump in wherever I am that you want to say something. Don't necessarily wait until we come to a time we might have lost the opportunity. So
excellent, Janet. There's a rabbit out the window here. I just want to draw attention to it.
Yeah, right.
Oh, okay.
All right, I'm going to be talking about the Mass, Tom, and we're going to be looking at a short history of the Latin Mass. And the first Mass was really the Last Supper, and it was the institution of the Eucharist. All right, the Church was, very small group of people trying to spread out all over the world, and so. After Pentecost, the Mass was said in Greek, because that was the language of most of the people. I suppose Hebrew too in some places, and largely in homes. I mean, there weren't churches, right? So they did it in homes, and it changed to Latin around the 2nd century. I mean, this was a Roman phenomena in a sense, that it was the Roman Empire. So they adopted the common language you had all these different communities with their own dialects, etc. But Latin was a common language. And many, as we know in the history of mankind, many countries have to adopt the language of the conquerors, and the Romans were the conquerors. So it was changed to Latin. So from the very start, Latin wasn't the native language of too many Christians, all right? It was the language of the church, of the state, and of the church, all right? So to realize that people say, oh, it was in the vernacular at the very start. And you say, well, that's a little bit hard to say, because people went off to their own places, and they did say it in more or less in whatever their language was, but it very quickly transferred into Latin. And around 400, the Latin Mass was then the norm. There had become a coalescing of different possibilities. And there was a way in which people wanted to have the Mass that came out of Rome. That was the papal Mass. And so people wanted to be in conformity with the Pope. And so they had different hymns in local communities, and even different saints' days, different preference for the saints of their community. But that soon became kind of all under the umbrella of Rome, not deciding and not imposing. People were voluntarily adopting a unity. They wanted to be in unity with Rome.
Well, and Janet, just to say, not only the language, but the basic form of the Mass, the way it was celebrated. You have 2nd century texts that show a description of what happened at the Mass. In fact, there's an extended one in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And when you read through it, it's like, hey, there's the liturgy of the Word, there's the liturgy of the Eucharist. And in fact, one of the oldest Christian gathering places for liturgy, they have one of the earliest churches had a much bigger distinction between the sort of the front entry place where they would do the liturgy of the word, and then they would elevate up to another place where those who were members fully initiated would be able to celebrate the Eucharist itself. So even early on, the structure of the Mass and the structure of the space in which they worshiped looks a lot like what we do today.
Oh yeah, it's very interesting to read the history of the architecture. And you're right. I mean, it was basically set from the start, and then there were refinements of different kinds. But it's not as if there were radical changes anywhere along the line. The changes were really quite organic, all right? And some of them followed a deeper understanding of the Christian faith and what was happening here and who had different roles. There were reforms during the time of Gregory the Great, and he's the one that really really promoted, say, the chant, right? Gregorian chant, because of Gregory the Great. And that's pretty much where we had the Mass. The changes from this point forward, not that there were huge ones before this, but from this time forward, they were pretty much fine-tuning, right? There weren't any radical changes in the Mass. Of course, it will depend on what you think is radical, but those who go to the TLM now and had gone to the Mass of Gregory the Great would say these are definitely the same Masses. They would have not had any, and probably much before that, but certainly at that time. At the Council of Trent, that's when we had a real codification of the Mass. There was very little change in the Mass from the time of Gregory to Trent. Again, there were all sorts of local variations, preference for some saints over other saints.
Right, but identification of texts, that was a big deal. The sacramentary, coming together. So the prayers that were the official prayers. You can see a lot of those things, right, in a way that you could draw analogy to things like the development of church law, even the books of the scriptures, right? Which books were inspired texts. You can see this process of discerning, of winnowing out and synthesizing together. These are the things that are ours fully, and we will embrace these as the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's right. And with the Protestant Reformation, of course, Luther wanted to have a radical change in the Mass. Basically, that there was not the real presence, and that this was more of a meal than a sacrifice. And so that one of the jobs of the Council of Trent was to try to really lay down the law on what a Catholic Mass was and what it had to be. And you couldn't, the Catholics could go to a Lutheran Mass and think that it was Mass. It would still look a lot the same. I mean, even today, you go to a Lutheran Mass, you stand in the Catholic Mass, but the understanding of the sacraments is very much different. And so this is in a sense where then you really had a codification of the Mass, where even more so it becomes, this is the Mass. This is the way Catholics do the Mass universally. And it was in that sense, at that time, it was more or less imposed, in the sense of the Rome said this is the way it's going to be everywhere. But they did a very nice thing, which they said any Mass that's been said for the last 200 years can continue to be said, because we know that this is what people understand the Mass to be. So they didn't say everything's wiped out. They said everything for the last 200 years. But going forward, this is the Mass that we're going to be promoting in where there's new settlements of Catholics, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Then there was really not until the early years of the last century, early decades of the last century, there was what was emerging called the new liturgical movement. And these were people who were getting together to say, are there changes that should be made to the Mass? Is it really doing everything that God wants us to do in the Mass? And some people talk about as looking for very legitimate changes. Others talk about maybe a very progressive group trying to hijack it, that were sort of more Protestant than Catholic. And I haven't got a complete read about that movement yet. Do you have much of an understanding of it, Tom?
No, you know what? I wouldn't consider myself an expert in like the developments that happened in the 20th century. I've read a couple of books, but I wouldn't want to stand up and say, hey, I have expertise around that. So.
Yeah, I did read. I know that you've read, and I've been reading Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a beautiful book. Anybody who wants to understand the spirit of the liturgy, which is a phrase that's I'm sure in many other places, but it's certainly in Sacrosanctum Concilium, and he really explains it. I'm also reading a book by Dietrich von Hildebrand.
Oh, liturgy and personality. Yeah.
Yes. What do you think of that?
Oh, I love it. I mean, again, it's very phenomenological, right? It's all about recognize and respond, right? How are we receptive to what's happening, and then what are we called upon to respond to it? I've heard this story from Alice von Hildebrand that he like cranked out that book in a matter of weeks.
Mm.
That there was a sense of, wait a minute, what's going on here regarding the liturgy? We have to understand how the liturgy shapes who we are and is related to.
Yeah, it was actually written in 1930 and then rewritten in 1960. So it was still before all the changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to me. Again, I like phenomenology. It's a bizarre thing, but I mean, I'm not too keen on the word values as opposed to goods, just for any phenomenologist who is out there, just to say that. But but I really do. I very much appreciate the way he writes and his sensitivities and the clear distinctions he makes. So those are two. I've read other books, and if we have time, I'll mention some of them.
And just to say, if folks are going to read Liturgy and Personality, there's a short book he has called Fundamental Moral Attitudes, where he lays out these 5 fundamental attitudes that are essentially form us as human beings appropriately. And in there, he talks about response to value. And by that, he means what is truly good, what is truly precious, what is truly valuable, not the reduction that we have today to values. Right. So, anyways.
Right. Yeah, no, I've found many of his works to be absolutely, I mean, The Transformation in Christ is an absolutely transformatory book. He's as much as a psychologist as he is a philosopher and theologian, and it comes from deep meditations on the movement of the human heart. So Thomas are going to have a little bit of trouble with him because he doesn't use traditional vocabulary. He has his own terminology. Mm-hmm. And you have to be, those of us who are Thomas have to be generous and try to understand what he's doing. And I think we'll find out that what he's doing is very attractive. All right, so now we're going to look at Vatican II and post-Vatican II. We're going to, as I said, we're going to spend some time looking at Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the first document of Vatican II, and it passed by an absolutely overwhelming majority. It seems that Paul VI was incredibly eager to get that document approved. These dates are somewhat important. I was a bit surprised when I was putting this together. That document was promulgated on December 4th, the end of 1963. And in January 25th of 1964, a little more than a month later, 6 weeks later, Pope Paul VI issued an apostolic letter regards the new liturgy. So he was right out of the chute on this before Vatican II was it all over. He was already starting to want to get in place what the changes should be for the liturgy. And then in February, there was a concilium that was put together, which is a group established officially by the church to try to figure out how the new norms would be implemented. And it was established under a priest named Father Annibale Bugnini. That name is extremely important. He was, by report, let me see, I've got one of these, I'll show it later because I don't want to go in and out, but he was found out probably to be a Mason, right? The evidence is pretty strong that he joined the Masons in 1963. His name was found on a list of Masons, and there's been a couple pieces of evidence that have confirmed that. Now, of course, I can't imagine that. It's impossible for me to think that Paul VI knew that. But it just
I never heard that. That's interesting. I haven't dug into all the sort of the controversies around him. So, I hear their name and I hear often sort of disparaging remarks, how he introduced a lot of Protestant elements in, did so intentionally, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I haven't heard that part that he was a Mason or potentially a Mason.
I know how some people probably will tune out right now. So This is just conspiracy theory, crazy stuff. All right. It's in several well-researched places. One is this, was it Harry Sire, S-I-R-E, who wrote a book called Phoenix from the Ashes. And he has a chapter in there about Bugnini that's very interesting. And there's a biography out about Bugnini called Reformer of the Liturgy by Yves Chiron. He's a little bit more cautious about that. But even since this has been written, there's been new evidence that has been discovered about that. There's one of the evidences is that after he finished his work, Bugnini was sent off to, I think it was it Iran or Iraq, one of those countries, all right, forevermore to stay there. He was obviously being exiled from Rome, that Pope Paul VI was told that he was a Mason. And I mean, we don't have any direct documentation that this was the reason why he sent him away, but he was the man who did the work that Pope Paul VI wanted. And then he heard this and he's gone, right? So it's worth looking into. I mean, don't trust me. I hope I didn't get it garbled, right? But it's really worth looking into. And as you said, one of the things he said, and that this is documented, that he had several Protestants on the concilium, and said that he didn't want anything in the Mass that would make Protestants feel uncomfortable, right? That's an incredible statement. He didn't want anything in the Mass that made Protestants feel uncomfortable. But before his Mass was instituted, in 1964 and 65, in various places, the first Masses were said in the vernacular, in French in France, and English in the United States, etc. These were not a new liturgy at all. They were simply a translation of the traditional Latin Mass, the kind of thing when you look at this red booklet that you get when you go to that Mass, you have Latin on one side and English on the other side, all right? They just took the English right out of it, and that was the vernacular, right? So there were a few changes made. There were things like I think the readings were read in the vernacular, all right? And there was the final Gospel of John was omitted as being too repetitious and making the Mass too long. And there were some hymns that were sung by the congregation were added. But was essentially, I mean, really essentially, the traditional Latin Mass translated in whatever language it was being performed. I actually do more or less remember that. I remember, because that's what I'd always read all those years. So when it came in the vernacular, initially it wasn't any kind of shock to my system, because this was exactly the same Mass that I'd grown up with. It just that it was in English. But in 1969, 1970, the Novus Ordo was published. A brand new missal was done in a Mass that, as we said, now if you go to a Novus Ordo Mass one Sunday and a TLM the next Sunday, you're going to say it. In certain respects, obviously, it's the same Mass, but in so many others, you always say, really, is this the same Mass? Right? And in the history of the Church, you wouldn't have had that experience. If someone that was worshiping in the 6th century and in the 12th century and in the 19th century came to the TLM, they'd say, yeah, this is the same Mass. If they went to the Novus Ordo, they'd say, what? What is this? All right. So it's that different. All right. And the most shocking thing, I think, of all, is that the TLM was forbidden. It was absolutely forbidden for priests to say the Latin Mass. A few were grandfathered. In fact, it's very interesting. A group of literary people in England, I think Agatha Christie was one of them, put up a fuss and went to the Pope, and he gave an indult for the Latin Mass to be said for that group. All right. So but that's when we had.
I think Saint Padre Pio, right? I heard that he had received an indult to continue saying the traditional Latin Mass in Latin.
Yeah, and of course it caused that's where we had the SSPX emerge. Lefebvre and others who said, no, you can't take this Mass away from us. This is the Mass of the ages of the Church. It can't be forbidden, and we're going to continue to say it even in violation of the directives of the Holy Father. And we had an incredible exodus from the Church at that time. Incredible. Millions of people left the Church because they said, I don't recognize this Mass. what is this? What church is this? This isn't the church I grew up in. So all I want to say is if there's ever any changes again in the church, don't be that heavy-handed about it. As I said at the Council of Trent, that's not what happened. Any liturgy that had been in operation for the last 200 years was still permitted. And as we'll get to Benedict's statement, Pope Benedict basically said it never, ever should have been forbidden. And the forbidding of it was wrong, that whenever anything that's been in the church for 1,500 years, if not basically 2,000 years, you can't say it's wrong for people to say that Mass and go to that Mass. So we had some movement in 1984 when Pope John Paul II gave an indult for saying that a traditional Mass with permission of the bishop. That didn't work that well. A lot of bishops didn't give permission. Priests would go, laity would go. They might let them say, one on a Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock in some inner city church that everybody was scared to go into. And it really didn't satisfy those who felt a need for the traditional Latin Mass. So 4 years later, Pope John Paul II asked bishops to be generous. He said, don't be so ungenerous in granting permission. And in 1988 is the same time you had the founding of the Fraternity of St. Peter, which was a break off from the SSPX, who said they were in unity with the Holy Church. They accepted the validity of the Novus Ordo, but they asked if they could only say the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass. That was a big moment. In 1990 in Africa, and then in 2008, there was a formalization of the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest, which is, I believe, the priests who run the Mass that you go to. Is that correct, Tom?
Actually, there is a group. There is a group of them in the area, but it's the priestly fraternity of St. Peter
that you go to.
Yeah, the FSSPs.
Yeah, the one I go to when I go further into Detroit than I went this weekend. As I said, the one I went to this weekend is a bunch of Franciscans. But I go to Institute of Christ the King often, St. Joe Oratory in Detroit, which is fantastic. And the very purpose of this order, as its charism, is preserving the liturgy and doing the liturgy in a very dignified fashion. So, but in 2007, this was a big, big moment for those who love the traditional Latin Mass. And that's when the Summorum Pontificum, Pope Benedict XVI was issued. And he gave permission to the priests to say the TLM without episcopal permission. The bishops, they don't have to go to their bishop and say, can I introduce a Latin Mass into my parish? They don't have to do that. It doesn't mean that some bishops aren't mad and make their life miserable because they do that, but they're not breaking any church laws by doing that. And he also said that priests must provide it if a group of laity requests it. And there really has been an absolute burgeoning of the traditional Latin Mass since that time. Parish priests, in fact, I read somewhere that the growth in the traditional Latin Mass is much more because certainly the Institute of Christ the King and the others are growing and starting new places, new communities in different places, but are simply parish priests who want to say this. As I said, the group I'm going to, the priest, I'm sure he's under 40. He never grew up with the Latin Mass, and he went to Steubenville. So he's very much stooped in the charismatic tradition, but he actually went to a Byzantine Mass, and it just blew him away. The fact, and he said, I didn't understand a thing. He said, but the music and the piety and the reverence just washed over me. And he said, I want this. All right. And then he found it in the traditional Mass.
Jenna, 3 quick points on that. The first is that I would say that, number one, I was talking with Carrie, my wife, about, where's the Holy Spirit moving? Holy Spirit, what are you doing? And she said, honey, just traditional Latin Mass. Look, you see life there. So I do think it's a movement. In other words, the Holy Spirit is stirring the faith of the people, the faithful, through the traditional Latin Mass. Second is one of the signs of this spreading beyond priests who are part of one of these communities is that you have the rise of this Latin Mass conference. It was going to be here in Spokane. It's been here in Spokane now for a couple of years, and it got canceled this year. You were coming to it.
I had everything lined up, everything.
I had a house ready for you to buy right here too, Janet. You're going to move here, you know. It's happening. It's just you haven't seen it yet.
When you get the ocean there, I'll be there.
Wait till you see how big and beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene is. Then you'll say, this is sufficient.
Oh,
And one of the reasons is that there's a hunger among a number of diocesan priests to be trained because they feel like inadequate. They've never been trained, formed. I don't know the Latin. I don't know how to do this. There's so much involved. So this is a great opportunity for diocesan priests and staff members or the laity to come and be trained to be able to offer the traditional Latin Mass. But the third thing is, and I've heard this more than once, even though diocesan priest doesn't need to ask permission from the bishop, so many of these priests have to sort of do it on the down low. It's like, you don't want to get this up on anybody's radar screen because then they'll just be shunted into a particular line and all the stuff that goes along with it. And so there's a real hesitancy for them to make it known that they're offering in their bulletin traditional Latin Mass at such and such a time. And which is really, that's a sadness. That's sort of a pressure away from doing it.
Oh, absolutely. But I do think more bishops are getting open to it because they're big communities and they're generous communities, not only financially, but again, with their children. And one of my close, a family that's close to me, I'm close to them, one of their sons grew up totally with the traditional Mass, but now he's joined the diocesan seminary. I mean, he wants to serve as a diocesan priest. So you're thinking, once you start seeing money and vocations, you get a little bit more open what's going on.
That's so good. I love that. Just go, Jen. I'm not going to say anything. Go.
Okay. Well, now we're going to go to Sacrosanctum Concilium, and Tom was kind enough to let me take the lead on the historical timeline, which, as you can tell, it was a sketchy timeline, and my understanding of it is sketchy. But we're going to look at some of the passages from Sacrosanctum Concilium. We're going to alternate between the two of us reading the passages and making the initial comment, and then the other person will be invited. But you were going to do a little introduction for us. Please.
Yeah, just super quick. Again, it's almost like it's almost betraying the document to say so little about it. So there were 4 constitutions among the 16 documents. That's the highest level of document. 3 of them were dogmatic. This was one of them, along with the dogmatic constitution on the church and on Lumen Gentium and on divine revelation, Dei Verbum. And then there was the pastoral constitution, right? The first time a document like that on Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. So this was the first document. And then there are also decrees and declarations. They're lesser, but still of importance. So this first one, this first of the 4 key documents of the Second Vatican Council is on the liturgy. And commentators have made note of the fact that this one was, it was fitting, it was appropriate that this would be the first document, since the liturgy is the source and summit of our life of faith. I'm learning more about the document in relationship to the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo Mass. When I first did a read on it and attempted to bring out insights to bear for the life of, for our lives of faith, there were 3 things that jumped out at me. One we'll be talking about, which is this idea of full conscious active participation. And for me, that was so important because in my own church work, the idea of people simply being observers, being passive. We'll talk more about that. The second was the concept of testing and reflecting. Like, if we're going to make any changes to the liturgy, then they ought to be done in accord with the tradition, and we need to discern carefully. And we'll talk more about that. I imported that into my own helping of people live their lives as disciples. Like, test everything and hold fast to what is good, right? 1 Thessalonians. And just that whole idea of discernment means what? Sometimes in discernment, you need to pressure test things. You not just don't come to conclusions immediately, but test and reflect, grow into something gradually, right? So there was a very valuable thing to me. And the third was this concept of Jesus Christ present in the liturgy as the high priest, who is the principal actor or agent in the liturgy, that there are four distinct showings up or presences of Christ at Mass. And those showings up of Christ, or his presences, he's present in the assembly that gathers, in the word proclaimed, in the priest who celebrates, and as Eucharist, of course. And that led me to a whole reflection on the linkage between the recognition of how Christ is manifesting himself in the liturgy and what that means for us as participants, that we're called upon to recognize and respond to the personal drawing near of Jesus Christ. So, there's a little plug. I wrote my book on the Mass called 4 Encounters with Jesus That Will Change Your Life. And what I did was it wasn't so much a history of the Mass or understand the symbolism of the Mass, but rather let's walk through the Mass beginning to end using that category of event. This isn't just an ordinary activity, but Christ is breaking in. When he breaks into your life, when you recognize you're seen by him through one of these presences, that he's calling you to respond. And so that's what I did in the book, is I just walked folks through the Mass and said, recognize it's Jesus Christ personally present here, addressing you and asking you to respond. And it's been very well received for folks who have gone to the Novus Ordo Mass. Over 50,000 copies, of the book have been sold in, around the country and digitally around the world, more than that. So the book has been very helpful, and then videos and DVDs, CDs, and all that other stuff, so that they can walk through the Mass with that sensitivity, that alertness, that they're there to participate, meaning that they're there to respond to Christ. So anyways, so I got all of that from Sacrosanctum Concilium. So not related to traditional Latin Mass versus Novus Ordo, but just drawing from the rich theology and the principles and insights of that document have been deeply impactful in my own life and in the work that I've done in the church.
Yeah, good. I was going to, maybe I don't want to take you too far afield, but I believe that I read in one of the discussions of Sacrosanctum Concilium that actually there were a lot of the church fathers who were there at the council wanted the first document to be on scripture. And saying that it was inappropriate to start with the liturgy because the liturgy in a certain sense grows out of the story, not out of scripture, of course, but the story that is there in scripture.
I'm not sure I can't speak to that point directly, but a little more indirectly. I don't know if you've read this book, Benedict XVI's Last Testament.
No.
It's a fascinating book.
Fascinating.
Right? It's just from a few years ago. It's like his last interview with the Ratzinger Report. Peter Seewald, who interviewed him, does this again extended interview, and he feels a little bit more freedom to talk about his experience at the Second Vatican Council, and he goes into that document Dei Verbum and a lot of the controversy that happened around the intervention that he wrote in his cardinal. He wrote it for his cardinal, because he was one of the experts there, and he wrote it, and it shifted the whole direction of that document in terms of what the emphasis would be and that sort of thing. So I highly recommend this book if you want to get sort of like another look at what was going on at the Second Vatican.
I've got to read it.
It is definitely worth reading.
All right, well, let's not linger too much on various tangential matters, and let's go to the first. Okay. All right. One of the major concepts of Sacrosanctum Concilium was active participation. I think someone said it. I think I read it. It appears, that phrase appears something like 23 times. All right. So it's obviously a very important concept. So, okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Tom.
No, so it's the Mother Church earnestly desires that all the faithful should be led to that fully conscious and active participation in liturgical celebrations, which is demanded by the very nature of the liturgy. And I think one of the other translations has full, conscious, and active. So fully conscious and active, or full conscious and active participation. Obviously, there's a richness of what is being called upon here. Yeah, I think you can trace it back to, von Hildebrand with his concept of liturgy and personality. It's up to us to recognize that we're not merely observers, and not just sitting in the pew. One of the things I'll say is the pew isn't the stands when you're in a game. The pew is on the field. You are in the game of the liturgy. And I think that is one of the things that I was really interested in learning more about, the way that the laity are active in the traditional Latin Mass as compared to, the new Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass. So that's a really interesting point to kind of to wrestle with and to reflect on.
We'll spend a lot of time on that, comparatively speaking, but just a quick note on the word conscious. It actually is one of John Paul II's favorite words. I don't have any idea if he had any influence on this or not, but it doesn't mean simply like, either you're sort of half awake or you're, subconscious or unconscious or conscious. Those are the words we tend to think of. But for him, it was really a kind of a full appropriation of what the reality of something was. When you're conscious of something, you're really entering into it. I mean, it's not just like a kind of alert. It's like, I know what this is, and I'm completely entering into this reality. And so there's no equivalent, evidently, in English to the word in Polish. So I don't know whether if he was influential on this or not.
So I'd say two things about that. The first is, for folks who want to dig into this more, read Ecclesiam Suam, Pope Paul VI's first encyclical. Now it comes out the following August, but you'll see a much fuller expression of some of the same kind of concepts of awareness is the word, or consciousness, that shows up in that encyclical. Paul VI talks quite a bit about how it's the consciousness is what happens when an idea or the truth of something inserts itself into our minds and shapes how we see it. And so I think that that's part of what's at work here. And I completely agree with you, Janet. If you take a look at Pope John Paul II's book that he wrote coming out of the Second Vatican Council as Karol Wojtyła, the Archbishop of Krakow, called Sources of Renewal.
Right.
Sources of Renewal. In his first chapter, he talks quite a bit about how consciousness gives rise to attitudes that overflow into behaviors or actions. And so it's the teaching of the Church of the Second Vatican Council that needs to be inserted into consciousness. And that's going to shape how we relate to things, or our attitudes.
It's a very important.
We've gone very far afield here, but it's still rich.
All right. So, the next one. Let me take this one. I think I'll read it, but you might have more to say. In the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, this full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else. For it is the primary and indispensable source from which the faithful are to derive the true Christian spirit. And therefore pastors of souls must zealously strive to achieve it by means of the necessary instruction in all their pastoral work. Now, let me just point out for the minute, there is really no definition of active participation in Sacrosanctum Concilium. It recommends certain things to happen, and you're thinking, well, is this what they mean by active participation, or is it something else? We're going to look at some thoughts of John Paul II on this, but again, it does say here, this full and active participation by the people is the aim to be considered before all else. And it doesn't mean a kind of consciousness that you just spoke about. Is that this active participation? It's not just sort of just sitting there as I don't want to make conscious versus lump on the log, but it's that you truly understand the liturgy. As you said, you would know what's in your book. You would know that these four pillars, you would know how Jesus is present in these four ways, and you would know the movement of the Mass and where, as it goes to this pinnacle of the consecration. And you would be, you would really be feeling that in a certain sense and rejoicing in the fact that this is happening.
Yeah, and Janet, this is for me, I'm going to claim my ignorance, but I'm going to say this, that it might have something to do with emphasis, meaning specifically that As I have moved my family into the traditional Latin Mass and looked at and read through the Missal and on the side columns, there's a beautiful commentary there. Some of the emphases that I hear is that the laity or the assembly is there sharing in the Mass of the priest. And so it's the priest who is celebrating Mass. And so there's almost a way in which the impression is that we do have more of a passive role.
Mm-hmm.
Passive in the sense of not in the rich sense that John Paul II is going to introduce in a minute here, but passive in a sense that, well, we can be reading a devotional book or praying a rosary, and we're present at the priest, the celebrant's liturgy. And, oh, the bells will ring to get our attention so that we can follow the cues. But, and again, this is not saying that this is the full meaning of what the laity are supposed to be doing as the assembly. And there are definitely prayers where their conscious participation is called out, even in those beautiful prayers in the columns. But I want to say that let's call it the existential experience of those in the assembly at this time, and the experience of these church fathers who are there at the council, they probably have had more of an experience of the laity zoning out and not being as fully participating as they ought to be.
The homily at the Mass that I went to today was just lovely, because I don't know exactly, there were only 30 of us there, but he seemed to think that a good enough part of those 30 were just tasting the Latin Mass for the first time. And so he gave a little talk about attending the last Mass and apologized for the fact that there weren't the red booklets. And so you couldn't even read the English, because with the coronavirus, not supposed to have such things. But what he did say, he talked about his own attending the Byzantine rite, and how he wanted one of those a Byzantine booklet he was with a friend, and the friend said, no, you won't be able to follow, you'll just be completely lost. He said, but what you need is to just let it wash over you. And I would, sometimes we think we're going to talk about different sense, but the active participation is knowing exactly where you are and what Latin word the priest is saying, and trying to line it up with the English and make sure that you're right there. And I think there's many different ways we'll talk about of this active participation, but this notion of knowing you're at a sacred event, and allowing whatever is happening to be a part of an experience of the transcendent, that the priest is here, that's Jesus. Jesus is in the community. You said Jesus is in the scripture. Jesus is in the Eucharist, and so he's here in all these places, and I am getting to just luxuriate in that, even if I don't have the complete cognitive understanding. Again, I have a consciousness that I'm in a sacred place where a sacred thing is happening, and that is the key. And so that even sometimes, if you're reading them, and he said to them, he said, if you've got, they at least had printed out, the propers of the Mass and the epistle and the gospel. He says, you have that. He said, look at that, and there may be something there that just strikes you as something you should let just nest in your system at the moment. And I thought the liturgy is so rich. There's so many different ways of approaching it. And we get a little bit confused when we think participation means I know everything the priest is doing and why he's doing it, and I'm with him every step of the way. I don't think that's what it means. He does have his job, and we have a different kind of job, if you will, a role in the liturgy. But let's go to the next one. Here's some of that idea of what needs to be done. Again, this doesn't amount to a definition, all right? It talks about what things might help active participation. To promote active participation, the people should be encouraged to take part by means of acclamations, responses, psalmody, antiphons, and songs, as well as by actions, gestures, and bodily attitudes. And at the proper times, all should observe a reverent silence. Oh, this was going to be yours. I want you to comment on it first. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. In fact, if we want to take the best, like a best interpretation or application of this, we'd say, oh, well, we see that in Novus Ordo, right? We see these different forms of active participation. And we may say, oh, well, maybe with the exemption of, let's exempt the last one, observing a reverent silence, that's something that has been diminished greatly in many parishes. I'm not saying all, but in many. So I would say here that these actions of themselves can be indicative of participation, or they can be indicative of just rote repetition that I've memorized because I've gone to Mass all these years. So there's no guarantee that undertaking these actions is going to be equal to full conscious active participation. In fact, one of the gifts of reverent silence at Mass, I believe, will be experienced more fully when you introduce your family and even your kids to what we call in our home quiet times, where it's not just everybody doesn't talk. No, we sit, and we've formed in our kids a capacity to be still. And it's based on a simple but powerful principle that in silence, presence becomes manifest.
Mm-hmm.
When we can learn how to be still, we become receptive to the unveiling of the depth dimension of reality. The deeper realities of what is true and good and beautiful can manifest itself.
Yeah.
And that for me ties very much to what you were sharing, Janet, about let it wash over you. No, if you can learn how to be still, it's a very active receptivity.
Yeah, active receptivity, right.
It can look like passivity, but it's an incredibly beautiful way of saying I'm just present before. It's like you're present before a painting, a beautiful work of art, a beautiful symphony. No, you're just present to it, and it'll unfold its depth dimension to you.
Right. Excellent, thank you. I think that's right. But also, I mean, if you go to traditional Latin Mass, a lot of what this didn't happen. It's not that there's not an opportunity to vary, but in with your spirit, and with your spirit, and with your spirit. That's about it. You don't even say the Our Father. If you want to sing along with the Credo and the Gloria sort of surreptitiously, that's fine, but it's not really encouraged. And I would say this, one of the things that happened is that what Sacrosanctum Concilium wanted didn't happen because we got the Novus Ordo. So there wasn't the tweaking, if you will, of the traditional Latin Mass that was supposed to happen. Right? It never happened.
Never heard that, Janet. That is so fascinating. What an interesting point.
Yeah, it never happened. And so we've got the traditional Latin Mass, which is pre-Vatican II. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the traditional Latin Mass that has had the changes made to it that Sacrosanctum Concilium did. The Novus Ordo made all these changes that were never recommended. In fact, are contrary to what's going on. I even don't want to say the spirit of Sacrosanctum Concilium, which was we're working with the traditional Latin Mass and we're doing some things to it. But it seems that the concilium that Bonini set up was just basically, we're not certainly going back to scratch, because as you said, you have to have the Mass of the catechumens, you have to have the Mass of the liturgy, you have to have the liturgy of the word, and then the Eucharist. You have to have all those things, all right? So there's still a basic framework and structure, and the essence is there, but they definitely got it down to its bare bones and then put in what they wanted to, not necessarily with a close eye on either traditional Latin Mass or Sacrosanctum Concilium. So we'll see some of that. Okay, do you want to read these since I read the last one?
Sure. No other person, even if he be a priest, may add, remove, or change anything in the liturgy on his own authority.
Ever see any violations of that, Tom?
I lived for 20 years in Seattle. Okay, I'll just stop there. Okay.
Yeah, isn't it incredible? I mean, for years I would, the more traditional priests would always say, read the black, do the red. Read the black, do the red. Don't bring your own personality in. Don't do, just do it.
Okay, so Janet, so I don't know a ton about liturgy, but in terms of like the folks that like spent their lives in the smells and bells world, but there was always this sort of caveat of, oh, well, we just follow the principles that were that were expounded upon and proposed in the document on the children's liturgy of the word, which basically said, if there are children present, anything goes. That's my way of saying it. But it was basically like, well, and for the sake of adapting this to those that are there, we need to be willing to shift things so that it's accessible to them. And it was like that became the hole that you drive the truck through,
right?
Because of that principle that was found in a document around the liturgy. And I know that I just simplified and probably ruined things, but in trying to say it like that. But I saw that unfold so many times, talked about in the seminary, and then saw it live in the church.
Keep going.
There must be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them. And care must be taken that any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically from forms already existing. Janet, that was something that when I read, I didn't appreciate.
Yeah.
And that was that the history of the liturgy, how you highlighted this, and the history from Gregory up until Trent, there were only the slightest of adjustments, and they were those that were organic. And because there was a tremendous sense of care for what had been handed on as having as something that we don't have a freedom to simply adjust haphazardly or for the sake of being more relevant to this particular moment or this particular group. So this is something that I didn't appreciate what really was behind it, honestly.
Yeah, no, this is so important, this notion of, again, you want it to be that whenever Catholics go to a mass, they see that it's like every other mass that they've ever been to. And the changes, nobody should be introducing innovations, a new form of praying, a new form of singing, a new form of anything that isn't organic, but it shouldn't be introduced on his own authority, number one, not on his own authority. It has to go through the system of the church. I mean, I remember when I was in South Bend, they had girl altar boys, which was a novelty at that time. In a sense, it was a novelty. And someone went and complained to the priest about girl altar boys. And he said, I would be loath to change a tradition of 20 years. As a Catholic, you got to stand there and say, you don't mind changing one of 1,500 years, but 20 years has a sacrosanct status. And you want to say, excuse me, we changed things wildly that had been in place for 1,500 years. In fact, we forbade people to say that mass. And then we willy-nilly brought in just about anything we wanted to for a long time. I mean, it's definitely settled down. We definitely don't have the insane kind of innovations that we had in the 70s and 80s. I mean, when I would go to mass sometimes at Notre Dame, I never knew what would happen. Everybody be invited up around the altar. One of the nuns would be standing by the priest and basically kind of mouthing the words as if she were doing concelebration with him. It's just like, what the heck? There's no reason for any of that. And people were just wildly doing it.
Yeah, and how much of that's the spirit of our time, right? Where we are rooted in a fundamental idea that we find our deepest identity by understanding where we've come from, our tradition. But we live in a moment that says we understand who we are by looking to the future, who we can be, who we will become. And so innovation is all about coming into the new rather than unveiling what has been handed on. So that dynamic certainly, I think, impacts things.
Right. Okay, I put up one more little thing for you there.
Oh, as far as possible, notable differences between the rites used in adjacent regions must be carefully avoided.
Why are you laughing, Tom?
Carefully avoided. I use the word carefully because around our house, when kids are just like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. And I'm like, you're so careless. You have to be full of care, careful. And what you're doing is you're being careless. It's like you could care less. And I say, you can't just treat this like this. You can't just treat this person like this. In this situation. So I just carefully avoided. I'm like, I'm not sure how much care was taken. And was it full of care? Yeah.
Well, but obviously, as we spoke last time, I mean, I've been in churches where there's an upstairs liturgy and a downstairs liturgy. And there's just, they're not, people going upstairs would never go downstairs and downstairs would never go upstairs. That's how different the liturgies are.
Yeah. So no, I would say that that's true in most of the churches, most of the parishes I went to growing up. The particular mass had their own particular musical style, etc.
Yeah. All right, let's All right, the changes to be made. The rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and unencumbered by useless repetitions, and should be within the people's power of comprehension, and normally should not require much explanation. Whoa. it, you know, certainly you can't say the TLM is short. It depends on what you mean by short. You know, I went to Africa years ago, and we went to a long liturgy in the morning, about 2 hours, and then I gave a talk in the afternoon, and I kind of complimented everybody for being willing to come back to the church after a 2-hour liturgy, and they're all shaking their head, and they're thinking like, what kind of mass could you have for less than 2 hours, you know? And then they said they had heard in the United States that ordinations are like between 2 and 2.5 hours, and theirs are like 6 hours. You know, and they would feel that they'd been cheated if they went to mass and it were only an hour. And if they went to ordination, they say, don't you understand the importance of this ceremony? As you know, we can go to a football game for 4 to 5 hours and we somehow think that's okay. But, you know, if mass goes over by, 10 minutes, everybody is just fuming that, he spoke too long, or this took too long, or he added something, he did a baptism, and I didn't know there was going to be a baptism, and now it's 10 minutes longer. And so I'm not exactly certain what it means by short. That word bothers me almost more than anything. But I believe that TLM has a noble simplicity. A lot of people argue about, are there useless repetitions there or not? Again, the final gospel of John, I love it. I've always thought the Mass, even certainly Novus Ordo, and if you take the gospel out, you have communion and then it's over. You sort of want to linger a bit. You want to appreciate what just happened. So I don't, maybe there's useless repetitions. But let's go on to the next one. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, and
all right, as I said, this one, we're now into looking at what different changes should be made. We've gone on for a little bit more than our hour. So I think this is a good time to stop, and we'll do another segment and talk more about the place of Latin, what place Sacrosanctum thought Latin should have in the Mass, what kind of music there should be in a Mass, and talk very much about the principle that we talked about before this slide, about adjacent communities not having radically different liturgies. And is there a way in which we can somehow bring together the TLM and the Novus Ordo so that we don't feel like do have these liturgical wars and we belong to different churches. So yeah. I thank everybody. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
No, I just think, and Jim, that's what you just said at the very end, I think is so important. Jen and I, our disciplines are different, right? So I'm a systematic theologian. Janet's background in antiquities and understanding things as a philosopher. This isn't our specialization, but you know what? We do have a special care for the liturgy and for what's happening in the church today. And we feel like the liturgy should be a place that brings us together. And so we just want to sort of share our journey of insight and understanding and get you thinking maybe and have a different kind of conversation going.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what we're trying to do, we're not trying to pretend we're experts. We're not trying to become experts. I might have probably read 5 or 6 books on this in the last year, which is, for me, that's like diving into something. I'd like to read 20, but at least I've done that. And a lot of you don't have time to do that. And sometimes when you listen to experts, they're way above your head. I mean, they know so much. Sometimes it's better to learn from people who are just a little bit ahead of you. And that's how I feel as far as
and just we want you to know, look, if we don't know an answer to something, we'll just make something up.
I generally do. Yeah.
All right, Janet.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tom. Good night now.
I look forward to our next session. God bless you all.